Prince Philipp of Hesse should have faced the gallows at Nuremberg. He was Queen Victoria's great-grandson and a high-ranking Nazi officer whose war crimes were quietly erased by the British royal family. Blackmailed by the Gestapo over his same-sex affairs, he became an asset for the Third Reich and abandoned his wife to die in a concentration camp. This is the dirty truth about Philip, Landgrave of Hesse, Queen Victoria's most scandalous heir. History often sanitizes the aristocracy, reducing their moral failures to mere footnotes. But the archival evidence left behind after the Second World War tells a highly documented story of how the preservation of the royal bloodline took absolute precedence over the prosecution of war crimes. Prince Philip was born in 1896 into the House of Hesse, one of the most prominent aristocratic families in the German Empire. His mother, Princess Margaret of Prussia, was the youngest sister of Kaiser Wilhelm II and the granddaughter of Britain's Queen Victoria. In the aristocratic ecosystem of Europe, this bloodline was the ultimate currency. It connected him directly to the thrones of Great Britain, Russia, Greece, and Romania. The primary objective for anyone in Philip's position was the preservation of a pure, traditional public image to maintain the strategic alliances these bloodlines represented. Philip, however, was fundamentally at odds with this expectation. Following the collapse of the German Empire after World War I, the rigid structures of the royal courts were briefly suspended. By the 1920s, Weimar-era Berlin had become the liberal capital of Europe. It was a city characterized by stark economic contrasts, hyperinflation, and a thriving, highly visible underground subculture. For Philip, this environment offered an escape from the suffocating protocols of his family. Historical accounts, police records, and private correspondences from the era indicate that Philip was highly active in Berlin's underground scene. He did not merely participate in the upper-class bohemian circles. He was drawn specifically to what is termed rough trade. He actively sought out relationships with working-class men, street hustlers, and, increasingly, the violent enforcers of the early Nazi Party, the Sturmabteilung, or SA. This preference crossed strictly enforced class lines. Beyond the criminalization of his sexuality under paragraph 175, his clandestine associations with political paramilitaries posed a catastrophic threat to his family's reputation. A great-grandson of Queen Victoria, fraternizing with destitute street criminals and political paramilitaries in the slums of Berlin was a scandal that could shatter the carefully cultivated image of the European aristocracy. The British royal family, navigating their own post-war public relations challenges, viewed any association with Weimar decadence as a direct threat to their institutional stability. Recognizing the mounting rumors and the urgent need for a conventional facade, a solution was engineered. In 1925, Philip married Princess Mafalda of Savoy. Mafalda was the daughter of King Victor Emmanuel III of Italy, a monarch whose influence was crucial in the volatile politics of the Mediterranean. On paper, this union was a diplomatic triumph. It united two great European houses and cemented a relationship between the German aristocracy and the Italian throne. The international press celebrated the wedding, focusing on the glamour and the continuation of royal traditions. In reality, it was a classic marriage of convenience, a lavender marriage designed entirely to shield Philippe from scrutiny regarding his private life. The marriage provided him with the ultimate alibi. Mafalda, raised within the strict conservative confines of the Italian court, was largely unaware of the true nature of her husband's life in Germany. She fulfilled her duty, providing heirs and maintaining the public image of a devoted royal couple. But as the 1920s gave way to the 1930s, the political landscape of Germany shifted violently. The Weimar Republic collapsed, and a new power structure emerged that did not care about royal alibis or aristocratic privilege, except where it could be exploited. Adolf Hitler and the National Socialist German Workers' Party recognized the value of the old aristocracy. While Hitler personally despised the royals, he understood that figures like Prince Philipp provided a veneer of legitimacy to his radical movement. For their part, many aristocrats saw the Nazis as a bulwark against communism and a mechanism to restore their lost prestige and property. Philipp formally joined the Nazi Party in 1930. The motivation was largely opportunistic, driven by a desire to reclaim the power stripped from his family after the First World War. Because of his royal connections across Europe, particularly his marriage into the Italian royal family and his blood ties to the British throne, Hitler found Philipp immensely useful as a diplomatic backchannel. Philipp was rapidly promoted within the party apparatus, eventually becoming an Obergruppenführer in the SA and the governor of Hesse-Nassau. However, the Nazi regime was built on absolute control and pervasive paranoia. Heinrich Himmler's Gestapo, the secret state police, systematically gathered compromising intelligence on high-ranking officials to ensure loyalty. They were acutely aware of the Weimar underground and had inherited extensive police files from the previous era. The Gestapo focused their attention on Philipp, compiling what was colloquially known within intelligence circles as a pink file. This dossier was comprehensive. It contained vice squad reports, testimonies from informants operating in the underground clubs of Berlin, and detailed logs of his associations with lower-ranking ASA soldiers. The intelligence gathered proved that Philipp's engagement with rough trade had not ceased with his marriage or his political ascension. This intelligence gave Hitler total leverage. Homosexuality within the Nazi ranks was selectively tolerated when useful, as seen with early SA leader Ernst Röhm, but ruthlessly purged when it became a political liability. For a royal with international ties, the threat was not merely imprisonment in a concentration camp, it was total social, political, and dynastic annihilation. The Gestapo's file was a loaded weapon pointed directly at the House of Hesse and, by extension, his British relatives. The file proved that Philipp was fraternizing with the very men he was meant to command, shattering the strict hierarchy of the Nazi military apparatus. Hitler weaponized this information. The pink file was used to blackmail Philipp, transforming him from a willing aristocratic participant into a compromised political hostage. He was forced to serve the Third Reich not out of pure ideological conviction, but under the absolute certainty of his own destruction should he ever step out of line or attempt to leverage his international connections against the regime. He became Hitler's personal art dealer, traveling extensively to Italy to negotiate the purchase of classical antiquities for the planned Führer Museum, all while acting as a spy and messenger between Hitler and his father-in-law, King Victor Emmanuel III. Philipp's dual existence created an unsustainable tension. He was serving two masters, his public duty as a Nazi governor and the dark demands of his blackmailers. The reality of Philipp's existence was a masterclass in psychological compartmentalization and aristocratic hypocrisy. As the governor of Hesse-Nassau and an Obergruppenführer in the SA, he was required to enforce the brutal, rigid morality of the Nazi state. He signed decrees, oversaw the implementation of racial laws, and functioned as a high-ranking architect of the regime's domestic policy. Yet, every action he took was shadowed by the Gestapo's absolute knowledge of his private life. The pink file was not a dormant threat. It was an active instrument of control. Himmler's intelligence apparatus monitored his movements, ensuring that the man who enforced Nazi law by day remained terrified of his own nocturnal activities by night. Philipp despised the vulgarity of the Nazi high command, viewing them through the lens of a European aristocrat, but he was entirely subservient to them. He was bound to the regime by his own indulgences, a hostage to the working-class men and violent paramilitaries he had sought out in the shadows of Berlin. This leverage proved invaluable to Hitler as the geopolitical landscape of Europe began to fracture. Because of his marriage to Princess Mafalda, Philipp was the perfect diplomatic asset for operations in Italy. He was dispatched repeatedly to Rome, acting as a confidential courier between Hitler and Benito Mussolini, and more importantly, between Hitler and King Victor Emmanuel III. Philipp was forced to navigate the highest echelons of European power while wearing a wire of blackmail around his neck. He was trusted by no one. The Italians viewed him with suspicion because of his SS and SA affiliations, and the Germans watched him constantly, knowing that his primary loyalty was to his own survival and the concealment of his secrets. As Philipp's entanglement with the Nazi command deepened, the facade of his lavender marriage began to disintegrate, exposing Princess Mafalda to the harsh realities of her husband's choices. Mafalda was a woman of the old world, deeply Catholic, devoted to traditional royal protocols, and entirely unequipped to understand the brutal, paganistic machinery of the Third Reich. She had been utilized as a diplomatic bridge and a biological necessity to produce heirs. But as the 1930s bled into the 1940s, she found herself increasingly isolated. Philipp spent vast amounts of time away from their estates, either performing his duties as governor, executing diplomatic missions for Hitler, or disappearing into the shielded private quarters where the Gestapo continued to track his affairs. Mafalda lived in a state of luxurious confinement, surrounded by the growing horror of a regime she fundamentally opposed but was married into. She became a prisoner of her husband's alibi. The breaking point for this unsustainable dynamic arrived in the summer of 1943, triggered by catastrophic military failures. The Allied forces had successfully invaded Sicily, bringing the war directly to the Italian mainland. Recognizing that Mussolini's alliance with Germany was leading his country to total destruction, King Victor Emmanuel III orchestrated a ruthless political coup. In July 1943, the king summoned Mussolini, dismissed him from office, and had him arrested. By September, Italy had signed a secret armistice with the Allies, effectively severing ties with the Axis powers and declaring war on Germany. Hitler's reaction was one of apocalyptic rage. The betrayal by Italy was a strategic disaster, and his paranoia immediately turned toward the House of Hesse. Given Philipp's status as the son-in-law of the Italian king, Hitler became convinced that Philipp had been acting as a double agent, leaking German military secrets and facilitating the Italian defection. The calculation in Berlin shifted overnight. The pink file was no longer required to control Philipp. His usefulness as a diplomatic puppet had evaporated, and his proximity to the Italian throne now made him an active threat. In early September 1943, Philipp received an urgent summons to Hitler's military headquarters, the Wolfschanze, deep in the forests of East Prussia. It was a command he could not refuse, though he likely understood the peril it carried. Upon his arrival, the pretense of royal privilege was instantly shattered. By direct order of the Führer, Philipp was arrested by the Gestapo. He was stripped of his SA uniform, his rank, and his aristocratic dignity. The man who had sold his autonomy to hide his sexual secrets was now reduced to a high-value political prisoner. He was transferred to the Flossenburg concentration camp, placed in solitary confinement, and subjected to relentless interrogation. Hitler did not execute him immediately. Philipp was kept alive purely as a potential hostage and a pawn for future negotiations. But the vengeance of the Third Reich was not satisfied with Philipp's imprisonment. The true horror of his compromise was realized in the fate of the woman he had used to mask it. At the time of the Italian armistice, Princess Mafalda was far from the safety of Rome. She had traveled to Bulgaria to attend the funeral of her brother-in-law, King Boris III, a man who many suspected had been poisoned by the Nazis. As she desperately made her way back to Italy, the country was descending into chaos. German forces were rapidly occupying Rome, executing Operation Axa to disarm the Italian army and seize control of the capital. Mafalda managed to reach the Vatican, a neutral sovereign territory that offered absolute sanctuary. She was safe behind its walls. However, her children had been left at the family estate in Hesse, and she was entirely unaware of her husband's arrest in East Prussia. The Gestapo, operating under direct orders from Berlin to secure the Italian royal family, recognized that they could not breach the Vatican to extract her. Instead, they utilized a calculated psychological trap, exploiting her devotion to the husband who had long since abandoned her. The SS commander in Rome, Herbert Kappler, orchestrated the deception. A message was delivered to the Vatican informing Mafalda that there was a secure, urgent telephone call waiting for her at the German embassy from her husband in Germany. It was a fabricated lifeline. Driven by desperation to understand Philipp's status and secure the safety of her children, Mafalda made the fatal decision to leave the sanctuary of the Vatican. She arrived at the German embassy expecting to hear her husband's voice. Instead, the heavy iron doors were locked behind her. She was immediately seized by Gestapo agents, subjected to intense interrogation regarding her father's political maneuvers, and informed that she was an enemy of the state. Stripped of her royal titles and her diplomatic immunity, the daughter of the Italian king was placed on a train bound for Germany. She was not sent to a comfortable house arrest or a specialized holding facility for aristocrats. Under the direct supervision of the SS, she was transported into the heart of the Nazi camp system. She was registered under the false name Frau von Weber to conceal her identity from the International Red Cross and the other inmates, and she was marched through the gates of the Buchenwald concentration camp. The absolute betrayal was complete. The marriage that Philipp had constructed to protect his own life had systematically dismantled hers, delivering a princess into the machinery of a death camp. The reality of Buchenwald, for a woman born into the House of Savoy, was a descent into an incomprehensible hell. Princess Mafalda, now stripped of her identity and officially recorded as inmate 262, or Frau von Weber, was housed in a special isolation barracks. But she was not spared the brutal realities of the camp environment. The SS officers who commanded Buchenwald were fully aware of her true identity. Her presence was a twisted trophy for the regime, a physical manifestation of Hitler's vengeance against the Italian monarchy. She was subjected to calculated psychological torment, isolated from the general camp population but forced to witness the daily atrocities committed by the SS guards. She survived on the same starvation rations as other high-profile political prisoners, her health rapidly deteriorating under the harsh conditions, and the crushing anxiety regarding the fate of her children and the husband who had led her to this abyss. Historical testimonies from other inmates who briefly interacted with her describe a woman of immense dignity, quietly sharing her meager food rations with those in worse conditions, yet profoundly broken by the betrayal of her husband. While Philipp remained a high-value political prisoner held in solitary confinement within the Flossenbürg camp system, entirely stripped of his wealth and aristocratic influence, Mafalda was left to navigate the brutality of Buchenwald alone. The lavender marriage that had provided Philipp with the ultimate aristocratic shield had become her death sentence. The climax of her suffering arrived on August 24th, 1944. As the Allied forces advanced across Europe, American heavy bombers targeted a munitions factory located immediately adjacent to the Buchenwald concentration camp. The facility was heavily staffed by forced labor from the camp. During the daytime raid, several stray bombs struck the camp itself, obliterating the barracks where Mafalda was being held. She was buried under burning debris, sustaining severe shrapnel wounds and massive trauma to her left arm. What followed was a demonstration of the calculated clinical cruelty of the Nazi medical apparatus. Mafalda was eventually pulled from the rubble, severely burned and bleeding profusely, and transported to the camp's makeshift medical facility. The facility was in reality a converted camp brothel that had been hastily repurposed to handle the massive casualties from the bombing. The SS medical staff, operating under the brutal protocols of the camp system, deliberately delayed her treatment. They allowed the severe lacerations on her arm to become violently infected. When surgical intervention was finally deemed necessary, it was not an attempt to save her life, but a botched, unsanitary amputation of her left arm. Left in a filthy bed in the repurposed brothel, bleeding continuously and ravaged by infection, Princess Mafalda of Italy slipped into a coma. She died on August 27, 1944, at the age of 41. The SS afforded her no royal dignity. She was hastily buried under the false name Frau von Weber, though fellow Italian inmates and a local priest secretly marked her grave with a wooden cross, ensuring the daughter of a king would not be entirely lost to the ashes of Buchenwald. The daughter of a king, the wife of a prince, and the great-granddaughter of Queen Victoria had been reduced to a nameless corpse in a Nazi extermination facility. While Mafalda was discarded into a mass grave, the geopolitical map of Europe was collapsing around the Third Reich. By the spring of 1945, the Allied armies were closing in on Berlin from the east and the west. In April 1945, as the American forces liberated the Flossenbürg and Dachau concentration camp networks, they discovered a heavily guarded cohort of high-value political prisoners. Among them was Prince Philipp of Hesse. The transition for Philipp was seamless. He simply traded the custody of the SS for the custody of the United States Army. Initially, his status was ambiguous. The Allied soldiers who found him were dealing with a chaotic, unprecedented humanitarian disaster. They saw a prisoner of the Nazis, a man who claimed to have been persecuted by Hitler. For a brief moment, the narrative Philipp had meticulously prepared seemed viable. He presented himself as an aristocrat who had tried to moderate the regime from within, only to be turned upon and imprisoned for his defiance. However, as the dust of the collapsing Reich settled and the Allied intelligence apparatus began its forensic examination of the German state, the reality of Philipp's history quickly materialized. The Counterintelligence Corps of the U.S. Army and the British Secret Intelligence Service began securing massive caches of Nazi documents, personnel files, and Gestapo records. When they ran the name of Prince Philipp of Hesse through the recovered archives, the results were catastrophic. The archives shattered his meticulously crafted facade of victimhood, revealing a documented SA Obergruppenführer and the ruthless Nazi governor of Hesse-Nassau. He had been a primary liaison between Hitler and Mussolini. The paper trail proved his deep active complicity in the administrative machinery of the Third Reich. But more devastating than his official service record was the fragmented intelligence the Allies began to uncover regarding the Gestapo's methods of control. As interrogations of former Gestapo officers commenced, the existence of the pink file, or at least the detailed knowledge of its contents, surfaced. The Allied intelligence officers realized they were holding a man who had not only enabled the Nazi regime, but had done so under the duress of sexual blackmail. The records confirmed his extensive involvement in the underground rough trade of Weimar Berlin, his procurement of young SA men, and his total capitulation to Hitler to keep his sexuality a secret. This intelligence was immediately transmitted up the chain of command, crossing the desks of high-ranking military officials until it reached the heart of the British establishment in London. The realization sent shock waves through the House of Windsor. The year was 1945, and Great Britain was emerging from a devastating, bankrupting war. The political climate was highly volatile. The British public had endured years of relentless bombing, rationing, and mass casualties. The general election that summer would see Winston Churchill voted out of office in a landslide, replaced by a Labour government promising sweeping social changes and a dismantling of extreme class privilege. The British monarchy, led by King George VI, was acutely aware of its fragile position. Their survival depended entirely on projecting an image of unyielding duty, moral rectitude, and shared sacrifice with the British people. Now, the king's own cousin, a man carrying the direct bloodline of Queen Victoria, was sitting in an Allied detention center, perfectly positioned to destroy that image. The Allies were actively establishing the framework for the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg. The stated goal of the tribunal, spearheaded by American prosecutor Robert H. Jackson and British prosecutor Hartley Shawcross, was to publicly, legally, and irrefutably document the crimes of the Nazi regime and hang its architects. The criteria for the defendants in the major trials were clear: high-ranking officials, military commanders, and key political enablers. While not at the absolute apex of the Nazi hierarchy, destined for the main Nuremberg trials, Prince Philipp of Hesse was primed for a highly publicized denazification tribunal. If placed in the dock, his trial would inevitably become a global media spectacle. The prosecution would introduce his SA uniform, his correspondence with Hitler, and his governance of Hesse-Nassau into public evidence. But the defense, or the sheer forensic process of the trial, would inevitably uncover the mechanism of his service. The global press would seize upon the truth that a British royal relative was an active bisexual who paid for sex with violent street thugs, was blackmailed by the Gestapo, and served as a Nazi puppet to cover up his crimes, ultimately resulting in the death of his royal wife in Buchenwald. It was a scandal of apocalyptic proportions for the British crown. It would permanently link the bloodline of Queen Victoria to the depravity of the Weimar underground and the atrocities of the SS. It would provide immense ammunition to anti-monarchist factions and severely damage the prestige of the Mountbatten and Windsor families, who were already navigating the complex post-war geopolitical landscape. The British establishment recognized that Philip could not be allowed to stand trial in any public international forum. Standard justice would demand his prosecution and very likely his execution for his role in the SA and the Nazi government. But standard justice was entirely incompatible with the survival of the royal brand. A covert, highly coordinated operation was required. The machinery of royal protection, operating through aristocratic networks within the military and intelligence services, began to turn. The primary architect of this intervention was an individual uniquely positioned at the intersection of royal blood, military authority, and sheer political ruthlessness. Lord Louis Mountbatten, the uncle of the future Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, and a man of immense influence within the Allied command structure, understood the stakes better than anyone. The Mountbatten family name was relatively new, an anglicized invention created during the First World War to obscure their German Battenberg origins. Their integration into the highest echelons of the British state was successful but required constant aggressive reputation management. Philip's exposure threatened to undo decades of careful social engineering. To save the crown and the Mountbatten legacy, the intelligence gathered on Prince Philip had to be fundamentally manipulated. The narrative had to be shifted from complicit Nazi war criminal to tragic aristocratic victim. The mechanisms of the incoming denazification courts had to be exploited to ensure he slipped through the cracks, avoiding the glare of Nuremberg and the gallows that awaited men of his rank. In the administrative chaos of partition Germany in 1945, the Allies established massive intelligence clearinghouses. It was within this labyrinth of classified paperwork that the fate of Prince Philip of Hesse would be quietly renegotiated. Standard procedure dictated that a man of Philip's rank, a former SA Obergruppenführer, and a regional governor who had reported directly to the Nazi High Command would be automatically classified as a Category 1 major offender, or at the very least a Category 2 offender under the Allied denazification laws. These categories carried mandatory sentences of long-term imprisonment in labor camps, asset confiscation, and, for those heavily implicated in the administrative machinery of the Holocaust, the death penalty. Philip was initially held at an internment camp in Darmstadt, processing through the standard military channels alongside thousands of other mid to high-ranking Nazi officials. But the standard channels were highly porous to extreme political pressure. The intervention orchestrated by the British establishment, heavily influenced by the Mountbatten network, did not take the form of a public pardon or a direct royal decree. Such a move would have caused an immediate political revolt in Britain, where the public was heavily rationing food and mourning the loss of hundreds of thousands of soldiers. Instead, the cover-up was executed through the subtle, untraceable manipulation of the intelligence bureaucracy. It relied on liaisons, quiet conversations between high-ranking British and American intelligence officers, and the selective classification of evidence. Lord Louis Mountbatten, serving as Supreme Allied Commander Southeast Asia at the end of the war, wielded immense geopolitical influence. While he was physically distant from the European theater, his network within the British military and intelligence services was ubiquitous. The Mountbatten doctrine regarding family scandals was absolute containment. They understood that the monarchy was not sustained by divine right, but by the relentless management of public perception. The exposure of Philip's pink file, documenting a bisexual royal violently indulging in the rough trade of the Berlin underground, and subsequently being blackmailed by the Gestapo into serving Adolf Hitler, would not just be a scandal. It would be an existential threat to the dignity of the royal bloodline during an era of fierce anti-establishment sentiment. The first step in the cover-up was the sanitization of the intelligence pool. The Gestapo records detailing Philipp's underground activities and the resulting blackmail were intercepted. They were not destroyed. Intelligence agencies rarely destroy leverage, but they were permanently classified and removed from the operational files available to the denazification prosecutors. The prosecutors building the cases for the Nuremberg tribunals and the subsequent local courts were systematically deprived of the context of Philip's service. They were prevented from seeing the true depraved mechanism that bound Queen Victoria's great-grandson to the Third Reich. With the most damaging evidence buried, the second step was the construction of a new, highly sanitized historical narrative. Philip's defense team, quietly aided by royal liaisons, began to exploit his September 1943 arrest by the Gestapo and his subsequent imprisonment in the Flossenburg concentration camp. They weaponized his time in the camp, aggressively framing it not as the result of a paranoid internal dispute between Hitler and the Italian monarchy, but as proof of Philip's inherent ideological resistance to Nazism. The narrative they crafted presented the prince as an aristocratic moderate who had joined the party early on with naive intentions of stabilizing Germany, only to become a secret dissident who tried to mitigate the regime's extremes from the inside. According to this fabricated history, his imprisonment in Flossenburg was his punishment for standing up to the Führer. This defense was a masterpiece of aristocratic gaslighting. It completely ignored his role as the governor of Hesse-Nassau, where he oversaw the implementation of the Nuremberg laws and the early persecution of the Jewish population in his district. It ignored his role as Hitler's trusted art looter and diplomatic courier. It transformed a compromised, blackmailed Nazi official into a tragic victim of the regime. The Allied denazification tribunals, heavily influenced by the American and British intelligence officers who had been briefed on the sensitivities of the case, accepted this narrative. The courts were already overwhelmed and increasingly focused on the looming Cold War threat of the Soviet Union. Western intelligence was beginning to view the surviving German aristocracy and military leadership not strictly as criminals to be punished, but as potential assets to be utilized against the East. In this rapidly shifting geopolitical climate, a quiet request from the British royal network to handle a problematic relative internally was easily accommodated. The legal maneuvering was highly technical, but entirely effective. Prince Philipp was gradually moved down the denazification hierarchy. He was removed from the list of major war criminals destined for Nuremberg. His case was transferred to a lower-level German tribunal known as a Spruchkammer, which operated under a significantly lower burden of proof and was highly susceptible to elite influence. Inside the Allied internment camps, Philip adapted to his new reality with a calculated survival instinct that had defined his entire adult life. He was no longer the terrified hostage of the Gestapo. He was a man keenly aware that the immense weight of the British crown was secretly working to pull him out of the fire. He cooperated politely with interrogators, offering vague, generalized condemnations of the Nazi leadership, while carefully maintaining his crafted persona as a marginalized, persecuted aristocrat. He knew that as long as the pink file remained buried in the classified vaults of Allied intelligence, he was untouchable. The sheer hypocrisy of this parallel justice system was staggering. While Philipp sat in a relatively comfortable detention center, insulated by his royal connections, the full horror of what he had abandoned was being uncovered. Allied investigators touring the ruins of the Buchenwald concentration camp were documenting the mass graves, the medical experimentation facilities, and the crematoriums. Within that complex, the remains of Princess Mafalda of Italy had already been reduced to ash and bone, entirely unacknowledged by the system that was currently working overtime to save the husband who had delivered her there. Mafalda remained utterly isolated. Left to endure a botched amputation in the camp brothel, she possessed no protected bloodline to trigger a Mountbatten intervention, becoming merely a discarded alibi who had outlived her usefulness to the regime. By 1947, the engineered legal process reached its predetermined conclusion. The Denazification Tribunal officially classified Prince Philipp of Hesse. Evading both labor camps and major offender status, he was quietly designated as a Category 3 lesser offender, a classification typically reserved for low-level bureaucrats driven by economic necessity rather than ideological conviction. The sentence was entirely symbolic. He was ordered to pay a financial penalty, which amounted to a negligible fraction of the vast Hesse family fortune, and he was credited with time served for his period in Allied internment. Prince Philipp of Hesse, Obergruppenführer of the SA, governor of Hesse-Nassau, and direct agent of Adolf Hitler, walked out of the internment camp a free man. The British establishment had achieved its objective. The crisis was averted. The global press corps focused on the dramatic executions of men like Hermann Göring and Joachim von Ribbentrop at Nuremberg, entirely missed the quiet release of Queen Victoria's great-grandson. The public never learned about the rough trade in the Berlin underground, the Gestapo blackmail, or the brutal abandonment of Princess Mafalda. The historical record was successfully sanitized, allowing Philipp to return to his life of immense privilege. He retreated to the expansive Hesse family estates, which had largely survived the war, intact. He resumed his role as the head of the House of Hesse, an esteemed European aristocrat seamlessly integrating back into high society. He would spend the next 3 decades living in quiet luxury, moving between Germany and Italy, deeply involved in interior design and the management of his family's extensive art collections. The cover-up was so complete, so efficiently executed by the Royal Intelligence networks, that the true nature of his survival was buried for over half a century. The return to civilian life for Prince Philipp of Hesse was characterized by an astonishing lack of friction. While millions of displaced persons wandered the devastated landscape of a partitioned Germany, and Holocaust survivors attempted to rebuild shattered lives in displaced persons camps, the great-grandson of Queen Victoria simply went home. The denazification process had successfully neutralized the threat of his Gestapo file, transforming an active agent of the Nazi state into a benign, heavily fined aristocrat. The machinery of British royal protection had functioned flawlessly, but the reality of his post-war existence required ongoing, meticulous reputation management. Philipp retreated to the vast Hesse family holdings, primarily centering his life around Schloss Fasanery in Fulda and the estate in Kronberg. The immediate post-war period was not without its indignities for the prince, though they were entirely financial rather than penal. In a bizarre historical footnote that underscores the chaos of the era, his primary residence, Friedrichshof Castle in Kronberg, had been requisitioned by the United States Army to serve as an officers' club. During this occupation, the infamous Hesse crown jewels, a collection of immense historical and monetary value, were discovered buried in the castle's cellar and subsequently stolen by American military personnel, including a WAC captain named Kathleen Nash and a colonel named Jack Durant. The theft triggered a massive international investigation, placing the House of Hesse temporarily back in the spotlight. However, the media coverage of the jewel heist perversely aided the broader cover-up of Philipp's past. The narrative in the press focused entirely on the victimhood of the aristocratic family and the corruption of the American officers. Philipp was positioned not as a former SA Obergruppenführer who had actively aided in the looting of European art for Adolf Hitler, but as a distinguished royal who was now being robbed by the occupying forces. The scandal of the jewels completely eclipsed any lingering questions about his political or personal history. The British establishment watched this unfold with quiet satisfaction. The public was focused on stolen diamonds, not on the buried pink file or the horrors of the Weimar underground. As the late 1940s transitioned into the 1950s, the geopolitical tectonic plates shifted dramatically. The Cold War descended upon Europe. The Soviet Union transformed from an allied partner into an existential threat to the West. This ideological pivot provided the final layer of armor for men like Prince Philipp. The American and British intelligence apparatuses completely lost interest in prosecuting former mid-level Nazi officials, preferring instead to utilize the remnants of the German elite as a bulwark against communism. The aristocracy, with their inherent conservatism and vast landholdings, were viewed as essential stabilizing forces in the new West Germany. Within this permissive environment, Philipp thrived. He seamlessly reintegrated into the highest echelons of European society. He resumed his role as the head of the House of Hesse, an esteemed patrician figure who hosted lavish gatherings, patronized the arts, and dedicated his remaining decades to interior design and the restoration of his family's extensive classical art collections. He traveled frequently to Italy, the very country where his marriage had been orchestrated and where his betrayal of his wife had been finalized. The most chilling aspect of Philipp's post-war life was his absolute unbroken silence regarding the fate of Princess Mafalda. He never publicly addressed her death in the Buchenwald concentration camp. He never acknowledged the brutal irony that the marriage designed to shield his homosexual encounters with working-class paramilitaries had resulted in his royal wife bleeding to death in a camp brothel. He raised their surviving children within the opulent confines of the Hesse estates, constructing a sanitized family history that carefully excised the true nature of his relationship with the Third Reich and the Gestapo's leverage over him. The children of Philipp and Mafalda were left to navigate the psychological wreckage of their parents' choices. They had lost their mother to the Nazi death machine and were raised by a father who had worn the uniform of the men who killed her. The House of Hesse, and by extension the House of Mountbatten and Windsor, demanded absolute discretion. The family code dictated that the past was not to be interrogated. Mafalda's remains, initially dumped in an unmarked mass grave by the SS, were eventually located and reinterred by her Italian relatives at the Hesse family crypt in Kronberg. Even in death, she was brought back to the very estate where the deception of her marriage had been maintained. For over 3 decades, Philip lived a life of uninterrupted luxury. The British royal family, while avoiding highly publicized, direct interactions with him in the immediate post-war years, maintained their private familial connections. He was quietly included in the broader aristocratic network, his presence a living testament to the absolute power of royal solidarity. When he died in Rome in 1980 at the age of 83, his obituaries in the international press were masterpieces of omission. They described a distinguished German prince, a patron of the arts, and a tragically widowed husband. They noted his brief, complicated association with the pre-war German government, but entirely omitted his rank in the SA, his role as a regional governor, and the devastating existence of the Pink File. The cover-up held firm until the late 20th and early 21st centuries. It was only with the systematic declassification of Allied intelligence archives and the relentless work of independent historians that the true architecture of his life began to emerge. Researchers delving into the millions of pages of captured Gestapo records and counterintelligence corps files began to connect the disparate threads. They uncovered the Vice Squad reports from Weimar Berlin, the explicit testimonies regarding his rough trade indulgences, and the frantic, highly classified memos exchanged between British and American intelligence officers in 1945, detailing the need to suppress this information. The unearthing of these documents shattered the meticulously crafted royal narrative. It revealed that the survival of Prince Philipp of Hesse was not an accident of history or a failure of the denazification courts. It was a deliberate, engineered obstruction of justice. The British establishment, spearheaded by figures with immense influence like Lord Mountbatten, had looked at a man who was deeply complicit in the most murderous regime in human history, and decided that his bloodline granted him immunity. This historical revelation forces a profound re-evaluation of the post-war justice system. The International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg was established to prove that the rule of law could triumph over the barbarism of the Nazi state. It was designed to demonstrate that no individual, regardless of their rank or station, was above accountability. Yet, the case of Prince Philipp proves that the system was fundamentally compromised from its inception. The gallows at Nuremberg were reserved for those who lacked the correct aristocratic pedigree. The justice meted out by the Allies was entirely conditional, subject to the veto power of the British monarchy if the resulting scandal threatened their institutional survival. The tragedy of this story is not merely the corruption of the justice system, it is the human cost of the royal facade. The House of Windsor and the Mountbatten family successfully protected their brand, ensuring that the legacy of Queen Victoria was not tainted by the squalid realities of a blackmailed bisexual Nazi governor. But the price of that protection was paid by Princess Mafalda of Savoy. She was the collateral damage of a system that prioritized the illusion of aristocratic purity over the reality of human suffering. She was married for an alibi, abandoned for political expediency, and left to die in agony while her husband's powerful relatives arranged for his quiet release. The legacy of Prince Philipp of Hesse stands as a permanent indictment of the elite power structures of the 20th century. He is the ultimate embodiment of aristocratic impunity, a man who navigated the darkest chapters of modern history, indulging his most dangerous compulsions, serving a genocidal dictator, and sacrificing his own wife, only to be shielded from the consequences by the sheer weight of his family name. The pink file was the weapon the Gestapo used to control him, but it was also the exact instrument that guaranteed his salvation. The British establishment realized that exposing his crimes meant exposing his secrets, and those secrets were simply too dangerous to the crown. Philipp's legacy stands as a stark indictment of 20th century elite impunity. He navigated history's darkest chapter, served a genocidal dictator, and let his wife burn as collateral damage, only to be shielded by the sheer weight of his family name. His secrets were simply too dangerous for the British crown to expose. But what happens when a royal scandal is too public to bury, forcing a dynasty to rebrand just to survive? The reinvention of Prince Louis of Battenberg would put that exact question to the test.